Hello again everyone from Tokyo, Japan, and welcome back to Japan Vintage Camera. Today's video is in response to a request I had from one of my subscribers who wanted to know how to overhaul an Aires IIIC rangefinder camera. These cameras aren't especially common, but you can find them on eBay and other places, but for the most part they are not in working condition. Though these cameras are very sturdy and very well made, over the course of more than 60 years, a lot of them tend to not work as they should anymore. This one arrived in the mail today, and it has a few problems, some of the common problems you find with these cameras, and thankfully it doesn't have some of the other problems that these cameras have. So the first thing I do when I get an Aires IIIC is I look mainly for body damage to see if it's been dropped or anything like that, because if a camera's been dropped, sometimes it can cause other damage to places inside the camera, internal parts, and other things I'll need to look at. This particular one, it has a few scratches and stuff on the chrome, but for the most part it looks pretty nice. The next thing I look for is how well it focuses. A common problem with these cameras is that the focus helicoid seizes up and it will not turn. And you have to be careful with this, because if you force it, you'll be able to get the focusing ring to turn, but the focusing ring just turns and the camera doesn't focus. The helicoid is seized. So there are two clamps in the focusing helicoid which attach the focusing ring to the mechanism, and if you push hard, the ring simply slides, but the helicoid itself doesn't move. I'll show you in this video how to fix a frozen focus helicoid in one of these cameras. Another problem that these cameras have is that the shutter sticks, and as you can see in this one, the shutter is kind of lagging, and as I cycle it I can see that it has oil on the shutter blades. Go ahead and take a look at the aperture blades and see what those look like. More than likely they have oil on them as well. Yeah, I can see a couple of a little bit of oil on a couple of the aperture blades, so this will have to be taken apart, the shutter blades and aperture blades removed and cleaned and all of that. Of course, another thing to take a look at is the lens. The front lens on this one looks fine. I don't see any marks or scratches or anything like that. Go ahead and take a look at the inside here. And the rear element looks pretty good too. I don't see anything in the way of fungus. I do see some more oil on the aperture blades, but we'll go ahead and take care of that. The film transport mechanism seems to work okay. Another problem that these cameras have is that the strap lugs can come loose, and sometimes they are missing. These strap lugs are made of cast zinc, and they're simply just press. They're set in, and then I guess a rivet gun or something is pressed on the backside to kind of lock them into place. But over time they can kind of wiggle loose and get pulled off, and it's not a good thing if you're carrying the camera on the strap and the lug comes off and you drop the camera on the ground. It's a good idea with these cameras to use one of those strap mounts which attaches the bottom of the camera, like they make for pro DSLRs or things like that, or to use a half case which has strap lugs on it. The half case lugs, even though the half case is made out of leather, I might trust that more than I trust these lugs here on the camera body itself. So another problem these cameras have, and what this one has, is that the glass has come loose, and you can see it sliding here. This glass never moves. This is actually a lens at the front of the rangefinder which is fixed in place, but these two lenses here for the light diffuser and for the rangefinder are just kind of glued in place in behind a black metal bracket, and sometimes, well, oftentimes the glue dries up over time and these work loose. Check out the self-timer. Oh, that seems to work. As always, I recommend not using the self-timers on these cameras because they are the kind of the weak link in the old vintage cameras. So To overhaul the camera, we need a few basic tools. We need some slotted screwdrivers. All of the screws in these cameras are of the slotted type. We need a pair of needle nose pliers, and we need some cotton swabs. We need a little bit of lighter fluid. We need some lens cleaner. I have kind of like the industrial size or economy size of lens cleaner here. A can of compressed air or a blow brush. Most people have at least a blow brush. And let's see, one thing that I often use is a little bit of lacquer thinner, which I carry in a syringe here. So that's what we need basically to do the work. And lastly, I've almost forgot to mention microfiber cloth. So we'll go ahead and get started on the repair in just a minute. So I'll be right back. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start the repair here, and I'm going to begin with the shutter on this camera because that is the most tricky part to working on these things. The Viewfinder and Rangefinder is quite a simple thing to work on. The shutter can be a little bit difficult, and it's not because the work on the shutter itself is difficult, but removing the shutter mechanism and such from the camera can sometimes be difficult. So to remove the shutter mechanism, we have to remove the lock nut from the back of the shutter, and to do that we have to remove the rear element group. Unfortunately, these cameras do not have any, I guess, slots in the rear element groove, or I guess rear element group to remove them. So we have to have a way to remove it, but without causing any damage to the camera. There's a retaining ring which goes around the rear most element, which has a couple of grooves in it, but when you try to turn those grooves, only the ring comes off, and that leaves the remainder of the rear element group inside. We have to remove this completely in order to remove the shutter. So that is where my lacquer thinner comes in the syringe. What I do is around the base of the rear element group and the lock ring, I will apply a little bit of lacquer thinner. And this is not because the threads have a lubricant on them, which tends to dry out over time, and it converts from lubricant into a kind of glue, which makes it quite hard to remove the rear lens element group. So sometimes they come off easily, sometimes they don't come off easily, sometimes they're nearly impossible to get off, and sometimes they may simply be impossible to remove, and then you can't really do much with the camera. Some of the cameras I come across, they have grooves which are some mechanic has put in the back, but they normally do that by using a flat bladed punch, and I don't really like to put hit the back of a camera with a punch. That's kind of asking for trouble, but that's what some people do. So the way I remove it is with a pair of long nose pliers like so, which is kind of a terrifying thing, but you got to do what you got to do. So what I do is I go ahead and I grasp the rear lens element with one end at about 4 o'clock and the other around 11 o'clock, something like that, and give it a twist. And this one came off quite easily and without causing any, I guess, deformation. Sometimes when you do this, when you squeeze in, of course it's going to deform the metal a little bit, and that will make it hard to remove the retaining ring if you happen to have to remove it to clean between the lens elements. Fortunately, these seldom get any fungus or anything with it between the elements. It's sealed pretty well. Now this one has a little bit of fungus on the inside of the rear element. I don't know if maybe you can't see it here. This is a G7X Mark III, doesn't focus particularly fast. And there's a tiny bit around the edge on the rear element, but it looks very minor compared to some of these cameras which I find. So I'll go ahead and set that aside. And the next thing we need to do is remove the shutter assembly, and to do that I need my lens spanner here. You can use this, or you can use a tool like this, a pair of needle nose pliers with sharp points, and you can engage the slots in the nut like so. But since I have the proper tool, I will go ahead and use the proper tool. And this one is very tight, but fortunately it came loose. That's another good reason to use the lacquer thinner, is it just makes this much easier. You can use lighter fluid or naphtha, like I like to use on like the lens retaining rings on the front, but it evaporates very quickly and it doesn't seem to penetrate these threads and stuff as well as ordinary lacquer thinner does. It doesn't take a lot of turns to remove the ring from the back. I use a screwdriver and just kind of put it in the slots and turn the ring out counterclockwise. Okay. And as you can see, I open it up and kind of everything falls out. We have 3 rings here. This first ring here, there's kind of a slot here and I guess a lever on this side. This goes to the shutter release mechanism, and it's connected mechanically to the shutter button. And when I push the shutter button, you can see this little arm moving here. So what I want to do is I want to set this ring so the slot is touching the arm. The next thing we have is this brass ring. It's kind of an intermediary ring or spacer, and I'll put that on top. And then this last part, this is the I guess intermediary gear between the shutter lever and the shutter itself. And when you turn the shutter lever, it turns this and pushes it downward. Maybe I'll give you an example here to cock the shutter. So when you put these in, you need to put them in carefully. It's kind of easy to put in the shutter release, I guess, whatever I called it, intermediary, whatever it is. And for the shutter winding mechanism, it has teeth around the bottom here, and I always put it in so I have like one extra tooth at the very end where it contacts the gear. If I put it in with too many teeth showing on the outside, when I wind the shutter lever, it will bind before it gets to the end of its travel. And if I don't have it enough, I will wind it all the way, but it won't push the shutter lever fully until it locks into place. So every time I wind the shutter and release it, the shutter will open and close by itself. So this should be the proper way to do it, but I can't really tell if it's the proper way to do it until I put the camera back together. Depending on the year of the camera that you have, it may or may not have this spring here. The spring is not necessary at all to the operating of the camera, so if you break it or lose it or whatever, it's no big deal. I said at the beginning of this video I would show you how to fix a frozen focus helicoid, and in order to do that, to fix the focus helicoid, you can see here in these 2 positions where I'm pointing the screwdriver, there are a couple of screws. And these are the screws which clamp the focusing ring to the helicoid. So by loosening these screws, you can adjust the position. So yeah, you kind of have to be careful with that, because if you put it in the wrong place, your focus is going to be off. So to unfreeze the focusing helicoid, we have to remove these 3 screws on this black ring in the middle. The screwdriver is just a little bit big. I got one of the screws out, but I've used a smaller one to get the others out. Normally you want to use as wide and thick a blade as you can to do the job. That decreases the risk of buggering up the the grooves in the screws. Okay. And I will go ahead and sit this very carefully aside because I don't want to turn these gears. These two shafts are oriented, one for the shutter release lever and the other for the winding mechanism. So I don't want them to play around with them when I put it back together. And around the base here you can see the threads for the focusing helicoid. To unstick these, I will simply put some oil on, kind of a thin oil, WD-40 or whatever, works pretty good. I'll go ahead and let the oil soak in, and then I will, making sure that the ring is at the end of its travel here in this position, I will tighten the two screws which clamp the focusing ring to the helicoid itself. And I'll just wiggle it a little bit, and eventually you can get it to where it begins to turn quite freely. And while I've got this one apart, I'll put a little bit of oil. Okay, this one wasn't bad before, but it's much smoother now. Alright, then we want to put it back together. So, a good thing to do while I've got this apart is kind of clean up. Around the base here, so I've got the cotton swab which I've put some lighter fluid on. Alright, and that's pretty clean. Now I'll go ahead and slide this into place very, very carefully. Just wiggle it around a little bit, and if it bottoms out like this, then it means everything is more or less lined up properly. And you can be sure that it's lined up because you can usually see the marks here where the screws, these lock screws, were located before, and that makes it easier to line everything up and put it back together. I need to oil my screwdriver here, it's squeaking a little bit. And then the last one. Oop, dropped it in the wrong place. Whenever there's a place nearby where a screw can get lost, it'll usually find its way to that place. I'm working very close to the center of the table here rather than on the edge, but even though I'm working in the middle of the table, screws often find a way to find themselves at the edge of the table to fall off and get lost on the floor. Okay, so once again, this is on tight. Focus helicoid is nice and smooth. I'll go ahead and drop the shutter release ring, the brass spacer, and then the shutter winder intermediary ring, and that's finished. I don't have to do anything else more with that. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on to the next part of the repair, and that will be overhauling the shutter. Okay, so let's go ahead and get on to overhauling the shutter. So what I'm going to do first is push the camera body out of the way carefully so nothing that I've worked on before moves. I need something to hold the screws in such, so I'll use a couple of old filters here. And for this job I need a couple of slotted screwdrivers, and screwdrivers with fine points work the best. Take a look at the back here. This has a spacer, so I'll take that out and put it in a safe place because the spacers are easily deformed and damaged. The next thing I need to do is I need to remove this little brass lever here. This connects the aperture mechanism to the aperture ring on the front of the camera. So I'll take these out. I'll put these in the ring or the filter on the right because So that should pop out. Like so. I'll put those in there because there are two more small screws which are small, but they're not exactly the same, and it's kind of easy to get confused between them. The other screws are the screws which hold on the flash PC sync socket. So I remove the screws, but I don't remove the socket itself. I'll just leave it right there. It'll rattle around loosely, but it won't come out. And this doesn't move too badly, but as I open it more, almost all the way, I feel it begin to bind, and that's the oil dragging. The problem with on a lot of aperture assemblies is that the oil can grab so much that when you force the aperture ring, it can cause the little pins on the ends of the aperture blades to break off, and then the aperture won't work properly anymore. Okay. Next thing I have to do is remove the 3 screws which hold the rear shell on the shutter. And depending on the camera you have and the shutter it has, usually there are 3 screws, but one is shorter than the other 2. The shorter screw is the one which is by the PC socket. So when you're putting the shell back on, make sure to use the shorter screw here. If you use a longer screw, it may stick out just a little bit, and when you reinstall the shutter, it might bind on something or cause the shutter to not sit flatly, which is not a good thing. Okay, screws are all off, so this should come off like so. And here you can see the shutter blades. There's a little bit of oil on them, and if I look at the metal plate where the shutter blades sit, I can see kind of a bluish or little rainbow effect, and that's caused by oil, which is sitting on the plate. So what I want to do next is I want to clean off these aperture blades. So I'll take out these screws. I'll put them right here because it's makes them easier to spot on that black background. Okay, and you can probably see that the oil on some of the aperture blades. So go ahead and wet my microfiber cloth a little bit here and simply wipe off the inside of the shell here, and then I'll go ahead and clean this off here. If I had a larger shop, I would probably have a chemical dip system where I can just drop these inside and let them soak for a while and take them out. But as I do this at home, I don't want to keep a lot of chemicals or things like that here. They don't smell very good and they're quite messy, and I don't want to spill that kind of stuff around the house. So we'll go ahead and clean the aperture, or excuse me, aperture blades individually. What I do is I soak them and I grab both ends with the microfiber cloth, and I kind of just pull this way. And that gets them clean, and if they're clean, they are kind of a gray color, not a dark, dark or like charcoal color. If the aperture blades are like a charcoal color, they're not very clean. So that's the color they should be. When you're doing this, be careful not to bend the blades. If you bend them, they can kind of hang up when you're operating the aperture, and it also makes it harder to reassemble things if they are bent. On these shutters with only 5 aperture blades, this isn't a very difficult or complicated job, and anyone who's mechanically inclined can do it. Earlier cameras like the Konica 2s and things like that had 10 aperture blades, and these are quite difficult to clean and put back together. Thankfully, as technology progressed and manufacturing progressed, they kind of made things easier. Make it, I guess, more economically, or I guess just assembling these things more efficient. It takes me maybe 3 times as long or 4 times as long to do a 10-blade aperture compared to a 5-blade aperture, when pretty much everything else is the same, because you have to line them up together much more precisely when you're putting it back together. For these 5-blade apertures, it's quite simple. So you can see the grooves here in the back of the shutter shell. What I do is I start by putting them with the pointy part of the aperture blade to my left, and I simply push one under the other, making sure that the pin on the end of the blade fits in the groove, and making sure that they don't come up over the edge. When they do that, then that kind of means that you know, you won't be able to put it back together properly. They have to sit exactly right. And unfortunately, it's quite easy for them to get displaced or moved, and then you have to kind of take them back out and start over again. And I hate nothing more than getting close to finishing a job and then having to completely take it apart and start over again. So all the blades are in. What I'll do is I'll turn the lever all the way counterclockwise, and I'll turn the shutter shell until it's in this position. It's probably upside down as you're looking through the camera here, but the 3 screws which hold on this plate, there are 2 which are somewhat close together, and there's one at the bottom, and it looks kind of like a bear or something like that. You have the chin and the 2 ears. So what I do is I orient it so the ears are toward the top and the chin is on the bottom. And here I can see this screw hole and this pin are close together, like this screw hole and this pin. And I simply drop it in like so. And I kind of wiggle it around until the pins line up. This particular part of the job takes a little bit of patience, and when they're in the right spot, they kind of just fall in where they're supposed to go. Not always, but usually. And if not, the good thing is that these pins have a little bit of a hole in the center, which I can grab and move over with the tip of a screwdriver or something similar. Okay, so all of the pins are now flush with the bracket, and you can see the screw holes are kind of lined up. So we'll go ahead and install the 3 screws which hold together. Okay, so there's one. I love it when I drop the screw and it falls right in the right place with the head sticking up. That never happens, usually. And here it's happened twice in a row. I should go buy a lottery ticket or something. That's how it usually happens. They end up somewhere else. Okay, maybe I won't buy a lottery ticket. Alright. And yeah, they do have a lottery here in Japan. Okay, and I won't make them really snug, just a little bit snug, and then see if that works. Wow, very easy now. It just snaps open and closed very easy with no tension at all. Now I'll go ahead and tighten these screws, and you want these tight because you definitely don't want these to back out and have the aperture blades pop out. Alright, so aperture blades are now clean, and we are finished with that part of the shutter work. So the next thing I'm going to do is pop out the shutter blades, and as you can see, they're kind of stuck together here. And if they're stuck together like this, you know that they're not going to open and close very easily. So what I'm going to do first is clean off the plate here. Being very careful to clean between the pins which hold the shutter blades and the pins which move them. And when you do it right, the wipe marks and stuff disappear, and you can see a clean, uniform surface without any oil on it. Alright, so next thing to do is to clean the shutter blades themselves, and I clean them a lot like I do the aperture blades. I will put some lighter fluid, and then I will kind of pinch the blade between my finger and thumb in the cloth and kind of scrub it that way, and it looks nice and clean. And get the next one. Okay. These shutters can have either 5 or 6 blades. There's no particular rule. The difference in the blade count is mainly kind of a way of fine-tuning the shutter. You can speed up the shutter a little bit by removing one of the blades. You can slow it down by adding a blade. So it's kind of a simple way to adjust the shutter speed. If usually these old cameras, because of their age and all that, the shutters tend to run a little bit slow. So to speed them up a little bit, if it has 6 blades, I'll just omit putting the 6th blade back in the shutter, and it's more likely to fire accurately. Alright, so the shutter blades are clean, so we'll go ahead and reinstall them. This is a little bit tricky of a job, but maybe easier than aperture blades. What I'll do is I'll put it in the first one, and I'll hold it down to keep it flat and in place, because if I let it go, it'll probably fall down. And if I put more after that, when one falls down, usually it takes the others with it, and you have to start all over again, which is annoying. Okay, and then the last one. Okay, so all the blades are in there. I'll let it go, and from this point I'll treat it very gently, because if I bump it or whatever, they might decide to fall in and I've got to start all over again. Next thing I'm going to do is this lever here. I'm going to switch it to the middle, and here there's a spring. So fortunately on these cameras there's just one spring. On other cameras there are sometimes 2 or more springs, and that can make it a much more difficult job. On the Aires it's just one. When I put the rear shell back on, what I do is I orient the cutout here for the PC socket to the PC socket here, and I can't really put this on and push the spring underneath. So what I do is I kind of lift it over, put the edge of the shell by the under the spring, and I kind of lift it up and pull it over into place, and then slowly lower it down so the screw holes line up. Okay. So it kind of popped down into place, and as I look at it, there's pretty much no gap between the rear shell and the bottom of the shutter, and that's a good thing. If there is a gap, there's something out of place or not right. And so this one looks good so far. I'll go ahead and replace the screws. Once again, as I said before, put the shortest of the 3 screws closest to the flash sink socket. And when you tighten in the screws, if you're tightening the screws, you notice as you tighten the screw, it pulls the shell down. then there's something wrong. Something is binding somewhere. It's more than likely it's the shutter release lever spring, which is stuck underneath here, or something around the flash sink, or perhaps one of the shutter blades isn't sitting on the pin, on its pin quite right, and it's holding the shell up. So you don't want to force it down, because if you do, it can cause damage. And if you're working, for me it's not a big deal. I have lots of parts for these cameras, for better or worse. But if you only have the one camera and you can't afford to sacrifice or break any parts, you want to be extra careful with it. Another thing maybe which I should have mentioned earlier is when you are working on the shutter, be sure not to turn the aperture or shutter rings. Don't turn anything while you are working on it. The reason that is so is because there's a slot in the aperture ring on the front which lines up with this tab, and if you turn the ring too far one way or the other, the check ball for the detent will fall out. And to replace that, you have to remove all the rings and such on the front and find the detent ball, replace it, and put it all back together. So by doing it this way, that kind of saves me a step of work. The next thing to do is replace these screws around the flash sink. Use my smaller screwdriver for that. Okay. Just kind of drop it in the hole and move it around with the tip of the screwdriver till it's pointed the right way. Okay. And tight but not over tight. Next thing we need to do is replace the brass pin which runs between the aperture ring and the aperture lever. So what I'll do is looking along here, I'll line up this lever with, there's kind of a brass plate with a slot in it, and the end of this pin here goes through the slot. Okay, and okay, that's in the right place. And replace the two screws. And these screws have to be kind of snug. For now that the aperture is turning very, very easily, I don't have to worry so much about this working loose, but to prevent any future problems, what I do is I put a little bit of lacquer paint on them, like so. You can use nail polish or whatever, and this dries, and this will lock the screws into place and prevent them from working loose as you're operating the camera. So we can go ahead and test the shutter and see if it's working. So amazingly, I did all this work with the shutter wound, so if I hit the release lever, it should work, and there it goes. Okay. And the weak link on some of these shutters is the bulb setting. So what I'll do is I will try it at the bulb setting. It's not difficult to fix. Bulb setting is working okay. So if the bulb setting is, if I fire the shutter when it's in the bulb setting and the shutter just kind of fires and doesn't hold open, then that means there's kind of a bent lever in the bulb mechanism, and that requires taking off the front part of the shutter assembly and bending the lever back into shape and then putting it back together, and then the bulb section will, or the bulb function will work again. I think I described that in my Konica 3A overhaul video. This camera uses the exact same shutter as the Konica 3A. The same aperture, same shutter speed system. The only difference is the rings and such that operate the mechanism. Aires used a different kind of system. All right, so actually that was kind of the easy part as far as things go with these cameras. The difficult part is what we're going to do right now, and that is putting this back in, because with these 3 rings and the spacer and the different levers and things like that, it's kind of difficult to put this thing back in where it belongs. So it has to be lined up just right, and in order for this lock ring to go back on and for all these levers and such to be in the right place. The first thing I do, and what makes the job much easier, is to cock the shutter so there's some distance between the intermediary ring lever and the lever itself. If the shutter is not cocked, you kind of have to wiggle it to get it around back there, and there's very little clearance. By cocking the shutter, it makes it much easier to put together. The next thing I need to do is turn the, I guess, X sync switch so it's pointing toward the sync socket, and then I will turn the ring here so this pin is close to the socket. And then I want to make sure that the shutter release lever is kind of pushed as far past 12 o'clock as I can get it. If it's too close, it'll kind of catch on the lever as I'm trying to put the camera back together. Alright, and also I need to kind of fish this sync socket into the hole here on the side. So yeah, this is one of those jobs which I don't like doing, and it usually takes me a few times before everything gets in the right position and it works right. Okay, so it's sitting down kind of right, and as I turn the X sync ring or sync in the middle, that's clicking properly. I know the shutter is cocked, so the first thing I want to do is push the shutter button. Okay, and the shutter fires. Okay, so that's working right. Next thing I want to do is cock the shutter. Okay, I cocked the shutter and it stayed closed, so maybe I didn't cock it all the way. Alright, so a problem encounters. As I said, this was the difficult part. I'm cocking the shutter, but after I cock it, it's not releasing. So let's lift all this back apart again. And let's see, is the shutter cocked? Nope. So that means I have to add another tooth there. Okay, that's there, that's there, that's there. And let me cock the shutter and try it all again. And using the hole here on the side of the shell as a guide for the sync ring. I'll feed it in there, wiggle that a little bit. That's working again. Push the shutter button. Shutter fires. Let's try winding the shutter. Alright, now I wind the shutter and depress the shutter button. It works. Okay, so you might think that that's the worst of the hard part done, but it's about half the hard part. The next part is having to tighten down the shutter nut without all this coming loose. So I will push up here and lift it up, and the film door will swing open underneath. And then I turn the camera over and I hold all this firmly against the camera body so it doesn't move, because if it falls out, I might have to start all over again. So all this has to be down firmly. Then I have to tighten the lock nut on the back. So this is kind of a difficult part because the nut has to sit exactly flat on the rear threads of the shutter. If it goes on at any kind of angle, it will go on cross-threaded, and that makes it much more difficult to put on. And it's possible for you to tighten it all the way down and the shutter and everything works, but then if it's off at any kind of an angle, you won't be able to get the rear elements group to fit inside the lock nut. So I'll go ahead and tighten it in. And thank you, God, for allowing this to actually work properly the first time. sometimes this step is something I have to play around with for 5 or so minutes until I get it to line up and for it to work, but it went in just right that time. The lock nut should thread in fairly easily with just requiring pushing it around with the tip of a screwdriver. If you have to turn it with a spanner, more than likely something is wrong. It's cross-threaded or you're not holding everything flat and flush. So what I'll do next is tighten it up a little bit. Not too tight because you never know. More than one time I've put a camera all the way back together only to look down and find out that there's a part here which should have gone somewhere inside, and I have to take it all the way back apart. And if I put this on a little bit too tight, then I'm going to have to fight with it to undo whatever it is, to solve whatever problem that I caused by forgetting something. So go ahead and operate it again, and it's working fine. And check the 1 second speed. Sounds good. Alright, and then feel a little bit of tension. It should be a little bit hard to switch between the 250 and 1/500th of a second, because when you're turning to the 500ths of a second, you're pushing against a booster spring, which pushes the shutter blades harder to get the higher speed. So everything feels okay. The next part is to replace the rear elements here. So what I'll do first is clean the glass with my cotton swab. There's a little bit of fungus here, but it's just a little bit of superficial fungus, and it comes right off like that. There's no need to polish it off or anything. And okay, and that part is clean. Alright, then clean the very back around the edges. There are 3 elements in the rear lens, and 2 are bonded together. Sometimes the 2 which are bonded have a little bit of separation, which you can see around the sides. If the separation is minor, it doesn't have any effect on the photos. The lens works perfectly well. If there is a lot of separation, it's not like on contact lenses where it doesn't really have any visible effect on the photos. You can just see it. You can see the separation with your eyes, but it doesn't show on the photos. On this, the balsam or whatever they use to bond the lenses together, it gets kind of opaque colored and can have an effect on the photos. Okay. And then I won't use the needle nose pliers to put it back together. I'll use my lens spanner, and using the notches on the retaining ring for the rear element, I'll tighten just a little bit. I said just a little bit, enough so it's never going to come loose, but not so loose, not so tight that if I have to go back inside the camera, I won't be able to do it easily. All right, so there it is. The shutter is fixed and it's working perfectly well. So I'll go ahead and put the bottom plate back on, and that's all there is to do it. Alright, and what we're going to do next is we're going to remove the top cover and clean and adjust the viewfinder and rangefinder assembly. So please stay tuned. Okay, so we'll go ahead and get started on the last part, and that is cleaning and adjusting the viewfinder and rangefinder. It's not actually a very difficult job on the Aires III. It's easier than on some other cameras. The only tool which is required is a single slotted screwdriver. So the first thing we have to do is take off the screw which goes over the top of the winding lever. Oops, yeah, there is one more tool that we need that isn't a slotted screwdriver, and that is going to be a spanner or a pair of needle nose pliers or a pair of tweezers, and you have to just turn out this nut, which isn't very tight. There's a compression washer underneath it, so be careful not to lose that. And then there's this guy here that has to be pulled out. Sometimes it's easy to pull it out, sometimes a little difficult. If it's a little difficult, you can loosen the top cover and wiggle it around and it'll come out more easily. The next thing we have to do is remove the screws on either side of the top cover. One is here and one is actually in this recess here, which goes under the rewind lever. It's kind of a long screw. And then simply lift the top cover off. Now these usually come with this plastic spacer which fits between the viewfinder window and the top cover. If it's missing, don't worry about it, it's not very important. It's supposed to prevent dust from getting inside the camera, but it doesn't really do a good job of that, so it's not going to make much difference if you lose it or not. And we have a couple of dust covers here which are glued onto the top. We have first one which is glued around the front of the viewfinder. You just pop it off like so. The glue which holds this stuff on usually kind of loses its grip after 60 odd years, so these things come off quite easily. Things to look out for often on these cameras: the glass here on the front, which has the projected frame lines. Sometimes the glue has become brittle and broken, and this glass will move around. If that's the case, you have to recenter the glass and put a little more glue to secure it in place. You can usually see the lines where the glue is broken, so it's quite easy to put the glass back in the right place and glue it. Another thing that is glued on, pretty much everything in the rangefinder and viewfinder is glued on. The mirror, the lens, the beam splitting mirror, and sometimes as I said, the glue is a little dry rotted and these things can become loose and rattle around, and it makes it really difficult to adjust the rangefinder if these are moving around. So first thing I do is I blow out any dust, and then I get to work by just cleaning the glass elements. And I usually start at the front on the big viewfinder window. This is a coated glass, and sometimes over time the coating wears off. So it may have some scratches and stuff to the coating, but that doesn't make a great difference in how clear it is. It's usually pretty clear. And I will just carefully clean off the glass around the frame line. Okay, that's nice and shiny. And then I'll go ahead and do the back of glass here as well. And as I've said in previous videos where I work on these cameras, I have a ceiling light behind me, and the light reflects off of the glass as I'm cleaning it, and that allows me to see any fingerprints or anything like that, so it makes it a little easier to clean it more clearly. I use my pliers here to flatten the tips of cotton swabs, and this allows them to reach into the corners of the glass where I couldn't reach otherwise. And you have to make sure to wipe these thoroughly. If you just go over them quickly with the cotton swab, it tends to leave a haze and a little bit of cotton debris stuck to the glass, but as you keep wiping and rubbing, the haze and the cotton debris comes off and leaves the clean glass underneath, and we want it to be really, really clean. A good thing about the Aires IIIC is that it has a very good beam splitting mirror in it, which is really resistant to deterioration, and is safer than most if you have to clean it off. Too many of these old cameras, if you try to wipe off the reflective side of a beam splitting mirror, the reflective coating comes off, and then it becomes pretty useless. Luckily that's not the case in the Aires IIIC. It's very durable glass, and if I get these cameras which are so hopelessly broken that I can't really do anything with them, I'll always take the beam splitting mirror out because I can use it in other cameras. I'll have to do a video on showing how to cut this glass to size. It's actually easier than you might think. And the beam splitting mirrors from the Aires IIIC or the Yashica Electro 35 cameras are very durable, and they're also really good mirrors compared to what they put in other cameras. And if you have another camera which needs a replacement beam splitting mirror, if you use one from one of these 3Cs or Yashica Electro 35, you'll notice that you get better focus contrast with them. The big mirror here, which reflects the frame lines, is one which very frequently comes unglued. It's nice and tight now, but I'll add a little bit of more glue to it before I put things back together, because eventually it will work loose. And though that's not so important in keeping everything centered, it's kind of, the dust and stuff from the broken glue and whatever can work its way around. And I use the pliers to bend the tips over like this. This allows me to get around corners and is really good for cleaning the inside of the rear element for the viewfinder. Alright, if we do all of this, it will be clearer and cleaner, but we really want to have a good bright focusing patch for the rangefinder, and to do that we really have to clean out the glass here on this barrel adjuster for the vertical adjustment. So what I do is I mark a line on the top like this and on the barrel, and then I remove the screws which hold on the strap. The strap retains the adjusting barrel, and I lift it out, and the adjusting barrel just pops right out. Sometimes it'll have a piece of paper underneath of it to make it fit a little bit tighter. Sometimes it won't. Now this glass here always gets hazy, and when it gets hazy it makes the focusing patch or the split image very, very dim. And by cleaning this out, it makes 100% difference in how well your rangefinder works. What I'll do is I'll bend this over just a tiny bit so it reaches in the corners. And I'll start by cleaning the inside. And this lens is also glued in place, so be careful when you're cleaning the inside not to push too hard, or you'll just push it right out of the barrel and you'll have to glue it back in. And it cleans up quite easily, and it's very nice and clean and clear now. So this camera will have a very nice and bright rangefinder when we put it back together. Okay, so go ahead and drop this back in. And the glass should face toward the right of the camera, and these little holes should face over to the left side here. And take the strap, and I'll set the screws inside it. Otherwise, lining up the screws is kind of difficult. If I do this, I can hold the screws vertically and get them started. If I lay the strap on first and then try to start the screws, then I have to play around with it to get the screws lined up and going in. Alright, and I only want it just a little bit tight because I still need to adjust the viewfinder on it. So when we're adjusting the viewfinder, there are two adjustments. There's a horizontal adjustment and there's a vertical adjustment. The horizontal adjustment is located right here, this screw, which you can turn in or out. And then the horizontal adjustment you have to adjust by turning this barrel upward or downward. And I use this long screwdriver with a very narrow point to adjust it. I can just stick it in like that and turn it one way or the other. You can use a safety pin or something like that. If you're making the adjustment without removing the top cover, you have to remove the flash shoe cover here by taking off the slotted screw and sliding it out. And here you see the access port under the top cover. And before you turn it, you have to reach in through the top cover and loosen these screws on the strap so you can turn the barrel one way or the other. I'm going to stand up and adjust this while looking at Tokyo Tower, which is a little bit a ways from here. Alright, let me start with and it's a good idea to start with adjusting the horizontal adjustment first, because in these old cameras sometimes the horizontal image, the split image, doesn't move perfectly horizontal. It moves kind of like in a slight I guess, I don't know, arc or a little bit diagonally. And so by adjusting the vertical adjustment first, sometimes it also adjusts the horizontal adjustment the right way. Okay, horizontal adjustment is pretty close. I'll tighten this up a little bit because the drum's turning a little bit too easy. Now I'll work on the other adjustment for a little bit. Okay. All right. So, the adjustment looks pretty good. Horizontal and vertical are right on. Go ahead and blow out any dust. And the next thing we have to do is put the top cover on. And if your little plastic spacer didn't fall out, it should still be here. If not, slide it back into place. If it's been bent or deformed and you can't make it work right, you can just discard it and not worry about it. Before I put this together, I'm gonna, as I said, a little more glue here. On the mirror, and I'll put some here on the lens as well. And I'll put the dust cover back on the top. And these dust covers aren't glued from underneath. They use a little bit of glue which just kind of overlaps on the outside and just a little bit on either corner. It makes it much easier to disassemble the camera if you have to get back into it, or if someone has to repair it again sometime in the future, which is always a possibility. Alright, the next thing I need to do is clean out and reattach these two glass lenses which are loose. So I'll remove this small set screw here, or it's kind of long, but and then I remove this, and there are two pieces of metal here which are kind of glued together with the glass in the middle. So I'll go ahead and clean off the glass using my microfiber cloth. Just kind of rub in the cleaning fluid with my fingers. These microfiber cloths, the ones I use, when I get them new, they tend to leave a little bit of dust. They're not completely dust free, but after I use them a little bit and wash them, the dust and lint goes away, and they leave a clean surface without any dust or debris on them. So the lenses are kind of glued in, and you want to make sure when you put this together that it's put in the right way. And what I'll do is put just a speck of glue here and a small speck here, and that's pretty much all you need. When it comes to putting glue in cameras, less is more. I use as little as I can get away with. I get a lot of cameras that someone has worked on in the past, and they put enough glue on the inside to where sometimes things break when you try to remove them. Okay, and that goes like so. Alright, and then we have to attach this back in place, and this also tends to be glued in place like so. You can kind of see the glue on the outside. It's not glued on the inside. There's a little, I guess, when they assembled these cameras, it looks like they put them together knowing that one day they might have to be taken apart. Alright, that's clean. So I'll go ahead and drop it back in. On the bottom here there's kind of eccentric which is locked in place with a small set screw. That's to make sure that this lens presses against the front of the cover tightly. If you don't mess with the adjustment, you don't really have to worry about it. Just leave it the way it was. And then replace the set screw. With this you have to be quite careful. You just want it to be a little bit snug and not tight. If you make it tight and you reassemble the camera, you run the risk of breaking this glass here. I've learned this the hard way. Okay, that's nice and crystal clear. I'll go ahead and reinstall the top cover. You have to work it on so that the grooves on the top cover fit around the strap lugs. It won't go all the way on because underneath, I'll take this back off for just a moment. And of course all this stuff pops off. This little thing here, this runs to the winding mechanism, to the forks which engage the film canister on the inside. And that has to be lined up with this hole in the top. So I'll show you how to do that in just a moment once I put all this back together. Okay. And what I do is, looking through the side in the gap, I can see that shaft is chrome plated and it's really easy to spot. And I just kind of turn it so I can see it through the top here, and I can pull it into place with the tip of the screwdriver, and the top cover slides on pretty well. There's another thing which I have to be careful of, and that is this indicator, which turns when you are winding the film. So once I put that on, I'll take my long screw, put it on the left side here. Sometimes it won't find the hole right away. You have to play with it till it finds the right spot to go in. It might move to the left or right or fall off. Just pull it back out and put it back in. Attach the other one. And put on the winding arm, the compression washer, and the brass nut. And this doesn't have to be very tight, just a little snug. And then put this cap screw on, and just finger tight is enough. Okay, and that completes the work on this camera. The shutter's been overhauled, and aperture, shutter blades cleaned, all of that. I've disassembled and cleaned out the viewfinder and rangefinder and put it back together. So this camera is good to go. It still needs a little bit of cleaning up. I'll go ahead and go over the body with some metal polish and also clean out the leatherette with some conditioner and a toothbrush. But here it is, an Aires camera, which is ready to go. These are really wonderful cameras. They are phenomenal shooters. People are very happy with these cameras. They were quite popular here in Japan. And it said here not only did they resemble a Leica M3 with their appearance, they also performed like a Leica M3 with the wonderful lens which these cameras were, I guess, given. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more videos about vintage Japanese cameras or photography in Japan, please subscribe. Thank you very much, and I hope you tune in again soon.